So I made a video some time ago talking about Final Fantasy 16 and how it didn't crack a million views on YouTube. Like I didn't notice this. Like somebody on my Discord had to point this out to me. Much thanks to you, by the way. But it kind of reiterates my point. Like it kind of reiterates that Sony basically failed to kill Nintendo and kill the Zelda brand. Right? Final Fantasy 16 has gotten about half the views that Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity has gotten. Like, let me repeat that. Like, the brand new mainline Final Fantasy is losing out to a spin off of a Zelda game. So, Final Fantasy has gone from like one of the world's premier RPG franchises to something that nobody is looking forward to. Like people like Super Eye Patch Wolf can like gloat on all they like about like how like Final Fantasy 15 was simply mediocre, but really having actually just played the game on Xbox Game Pass, like I would argue that Final Fantasy 15 is very likely one of the worst games of all time. Like definitely one of the worst Final Fantasy games of all time, because I don't think I hated Final Fantasy 8 nearly as much as this. In fact, if it wasn't for like Final Fantasy 8's like convoluted awful plot, like I probably wouldn't have hated it as much as I did. Like if they Final Fantasy VIII is like salvageable. If they adjusted some things, if they made some more made the characters more interesting. If they did all sorts of stuff. Like there's all sorts of things they could have done to make Final Fantasy VIII interesting. There's no salvaging Final Fantasy 15. Like none at all. Like you start the game off pushing a car. Like you go out and fight some beetles. It's the most boring asinine bullshit I think I've ever seen in my life. Like I despise that game, and I think like consumers by and large, like players, people who actually like tried to play this piece of shit, uh, they feel the same way I do. Like the Final Fantasy brand, nobody has any optimism for it. Like there's the spin-offs are dead. The main line is dead. They can't do sequels. They can't do new stuff. Like there's no optimism at all from anyone that Final Fantasy 16 will be good. Meanwhile, Nintendo is still pumping out great Pokemon games. Atlas has Persona. Like you have all this crazy stuff. Like Fire Emblem is like huge at the moment. Like Zelda is bigger than ever. Like they can't compete. Like we're at the point now where the Square money, right? The Sony money, like Square has spent like 20 years trying like sucking off the teat of like Sony Entertainment. Like they've reached the point where it's become like a noose wrapped around their neck. They basically hung themselves, right? They're premiering Final Fantasy 16 on a console that's probably going to be completely obsolete. Meanwhile, while Switch is dominating in RPGs, like I really do expect by the this generation, like JRPGs are going to be primarily Nintendo exclusive. Like we're kind of already at that point already, because like basically every major RPG franchise um, is either dead or on Switch or has a better version of it on Switch. Like Nintendo is pumping out like all this crazy stuff like across a wide variety of genres, right? Uh, like what does Final Fantasy VI offer that any of these other games don't have? Like people are arguing that like, oh, Final Fantasy 16, it looks like Devil May Cry, well, or The Witcher. Like, well, why don't they just play those games? Like in Final Fantasy is in essence trying to be something it's not, and as a result, it's not going to be able to compete. It can't continue with what it's doing. So that's kind of my thought on that. So disappointing. Like, wow, Hyrule Warriors. Like if Hyrule Warriors outsells Final Fantasy 16, which I think is very very possible. Like, Breath of the Wild did about 18 million units, and I think it's safe to say Hyrule Warriors will sell a fraction of that. But even if it sells like a fifth of that, that's still going to be like what, like 3.5 million units or something like that. Like pretty crazy, right? More than like Persona 5, more than a lot of this other shit, like more than basically a lot of these other major games. Like Zelda has basically surpassed that really fake ass wall that PlayStation structured around it. Like, oh, Zelda and Nintendo in general is for kids. They don't respect you, the mature gamer. Come play Final Fantasy. We'll take care of you. And that didn't work out very well even back then. Like while we were getting like classics like Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, the Oracle games, Minish Cap. Like you were getting Final Fantasy 10 2, 12, and 13. Like fucking really, like Final Fantasy has been dead for like a really long time. Like I'm not disputing that. The thing with 15 though is I think it was the moment that like people lost faith in the franchise. Like at this moment, I think all anybody wants is for Final Fantasy to return the glory days. Hence the weird defense for Final Fantasy 7R, which is also pretty bad. But I don't think watching Final Fantasy 7R, I don't think it's as bad as Final Fantasy. Again, I might regret my words, but like Final Fantasy 7R is a terrible remake, but I can't imagine it's as bad as Final Fantasy 15. Like after actually playing Final Fantasy 15, I can't imagine anything worse than that. I really can't. But the fact that they released the game as they did and didn't finish releasing all the DLC they promised and doing all this stuff, like who in their right mind would continue supporting this franchise? Like who? Like my recommendation for people who like Final Fantasy 7, 9, 10, play the older games. Like play the good ones. Like they're out there. They're always going to be available. There's basically like several of them, and then you can like work your way through like games like Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, Xenogears. I don't know, like 90s RPGs that people like. Suikoden I've been pushing for a re-release. Like there's all these things you can do, right? There's all these options. You don't need the mainline Final Fantasy game. Like they're not doing anything for anyone. Like you need to acknowledge that Final Fantasy is a dead brand, and if you want good turn-based Square Enix goodness, you're gonna have to stick with Octopath Traveler or Dragon Quest XI on Nintendo Switch. There's really no other option for you going forward.